Imagine what it is to spend the night in a huge house, already in itself a tetric one, that also worked as the oldest funeral home in that place. All our dead people passed by here, they had told my father when he arrived. He walked down the hallways looking for the origin of those murmurs, but he found nothing. Everything seemed to be in order. The house was completely empty. He breathed relieved, but his hands kept shaking. He returned to his room, but before entering, he noticed in his bed, the one he had left unclosed a few seconds ago, there was someone lying down, covered up to the head with his back to him. When he took a step back, whatever was in his bedroom made a strange sound, as if it could not stand the laughter, and it uncovered its head a little to let him see black, rotten hair. Like the hair of a dead man who has come out of the grave. My father died in 1999. I just realized that it is about to be 20 years from now that we are missing him. 20 years since he left in those strange conditions. He left us because his heart suddenly stopped working. He died far away from us, but all of us, the whole family, know that he died with a fear he had never felt before. What I'm about to tell you is what we've been able to piece together, the fragments of history we've built over the years, from what we knew and what the rest of the family knew, what his friends knew, what the last people to see him alive knew. Those who saw him before that night found alcohol, a lot of alcohol, and anxiety medications among his belongings, things he had never used before. Those who don't know him blame these things for his death and for what he experienced in his last days. We can't imagine the hell he lived, the fear he felt, to have had to resort to that. I share this story perhaps as a tribute, as a way of remembering him. This is his story. My father was born in Nuevo Laredo, Tamaulipas, but because of his work we lived in different states of Mexico. When he was sent to Sonora, the problems began. It's not because he's not here anymore, but my dad was an exemplary Christian, although we, the rest of the family, moved away a little from religion. My father didn't, and he always looked for the best for us, for his friends, for everyone around him. At Christmas, he would not only come with gifts for my brothers and for me, but for the neighboring children who were not as lucky as we were. That is the type of person who, on his first days in a new state, was approached by his own companions with a bunch of bills and a warning. Welcome. They send you this as a first payment and you cannot say no. Despite the threat, my father refused and was about to denounce that attempt to bribe, that act so shameless of corruption, but a very close friend within the corporation recommended not to do it for our own safety. So, a few days after arriving in Sonora, my father resigned and began to look for work, whatever it was, but all he knew was to be a policeman. We had to return to Tamaulipas with our grandparents, but my father was discouraged by being the first to receive help from his parents, unlike how he had been since he could work. Shortly after, he had news from his younger sister, who had been living in New Orleans with her husband since she was very young. They could get him a job there safely, but he would have to wait 2 months. That was not an option for my father, and the aunt gave him an alternative. A friend of her husband had a place where my father could work those 2 months, doing the maintenance of the place. It was in Gonzales, a town very close to New Orleans. The advantage was that he could sleep there without paying rent and send us almost all of his earnings home. Without investigating more about the matter, my father accepted, and 2 days later he crossed to the United States to take the bus that would take him to Gonzales. I remember the call he made to my mother and her laughing at that moment, making fun of my father's fear. The house where he would do the maintenance and where he would sleep was a funeral home. A huge house that reminded my father of the plantations of American movies. Given the area it was in, it could very well have been one of them. The first night he was there, a family of Mexican descent was holding a wake for a lady in this place. They asked permission to stay all night, as we are accustomed to here, but the owner did not allow it. She told them to come back in the morning. When she left, they asked my father, who was then the only employee of the place, to stay until 12, and he agreed. It was his first day. He was disobeying the owner, but the truth was that he had no way of denying it. In addition, in some way, he thanked the company. It was 12 o'clock and the mourners began to withdraw. It was a moment, unfortunately for him, to be left alone for the first time in that place. What cost him the most work was to turn off all the lights of the room where they watched the dead, where the body of the old woman was still found. As he closed the door of the little room where he would sleep, just closing it, he heard the weak moan of a woman, somewhere in the house. He left his room and could no longer hear it, but he knew it had not been his imagination. What worried him most was that there were no neighbors within about 200 meters around, so it was very difficult for that sound to have come from one of the old houses. Suddenly he heard the sound again, very muted but with more clarity. It was evident that he was not imagining it. Afraid, he approached the viewing room, slowly. Step by step he was afraid to open the wooden doors that separated him from the place where the lady's corpse was found. He only dared to stick his ear to the door and concentrate, try to hear what was inside. For 1, 2, 3 seconds, nothing strange was heard, but suddenly, a sound, it was footsteps. He slowly pulled away from the door and began to pray. There was something that told him that he was not in a good place, something that tried to tell him that he should not be there. And then he heard with total clarity how the steps inside the place moved away, as if they were heading to the other end of the living room, as if they had left the viewing room. But everything was closed with all the locks they had indicated. He had made sure it was like that, worried about doing everything properly on his first day. However, the steps continued. Walking, now on the outside, in a wooden porch that covered much of the front of the house and worked as a receiver. Was it his imagination? Was it some family member who had bypassed the locks to come in to see the old lady? His imagination, of course, everything had to be his imagination. But the lights then turned on, the lights that detected movements on the porch, and they turned on automatically. And almost at the moment of turning on, the moaning was heard more clearly than ever, coming from the porch, without a doubt. My dad was not a cowardly person, I promise you, but he only rushed to walk to his room, close the door, thankful that there was no window there, and pray until he fell asleep. In the morning, when the owner arrived, my father tried to explain to her that he had passed a bad night, that something strange had happened. She just smiled and asked, "Did he come to play with you too?" My confused father asked her what she meant. He told her that he had heard the cry of a woman. "Ah," she replied with a confused face that lasted 2 seconds. "Forget it," she continued. "Don't worry, it's the sound of the house and you'll get used to it." My father knew that explanation made no sense, but he preferred to ignore it, to think that everything would be fine. And after all, he had no other option. He was going to spend the next 2 months there, like it or not. My dad tried to sleep just after praying every night, as early as he could, with earplugs. The sounds, although never like that moan, were constant in the place. Distant voices, talks, moans, laughter, normal sounds perhaps, but not when there was no one nearby, and that is why they terrified him. There was a black man who also went several days a week to help my father. He was the previous maintenance officer who had retired weeks before, but he continued to go to help to keep himself busy, although his strength was no longer enough to work as before. He spoke very little Spanish and my father very little English, but they communicated as best they could. With this man, with his evident serenity and good intentions, my father felt much calmer. He was, to put it in some way, his only friend in the place. Abuelo, grandpa, everyone called him, and so did my father. On one occasion, it was already past 9 at night. Between the two of them, they repaired the railing of the stairs that went down to the basement, and then a family came to talk to the owner of the place. Someone close to them had just died, and they were looking to schedule the service to watch over his death the next day. They sounded devastated. My father could hear them very well from the stairs to the basement, and their laments contrasted with the laughter of a child who was with them and who, ignoring the sadness of the parents, smiled and ran around everywhere. The old man went out to his truck to look for some tools, and my father, waiting, closed the door and went down to the basement to have a look, among all the things stored there. It was where the coffins were kept, but it was also full of other curiosities that dated back decades. There were an infinity of things from different times, of different tastes, as if they had adorned completely different homes at the time. That's what made it more interesting. The basement door opened, and my father heard the little boy running down in a hurry. Still playful, as if everything were a game for him. However, the stairs were dangerous for a child of that age, and my father ran to them to find him. However, the child was much faster, and before my father could see where he was going, he got into the cells without stopping laughing. My father yelled at him to get out, that he shouldn't be there, but he couldn't explain it in English. While he listened to how behind the coffins the boy moved things, and surely touched objects that shouldn't be manipulated by a little boy of that age, giving up, he approached the stairs and from the first step, so as not to leave the boy alone, he yelled at the owner. "Boy?" she asked, saying it in Spanish. "The boy is down here," my dad said, "or girl, I'm sorry, I couldn't see, but he's down here with me." "No boy, no children," said the owner's voice from above. Peering from the stairs, she looked my father directly in the eyes. "There are no children with them, just two adults." It took my dad a few seconds to understand that no one else had come down, and when he turned in the darkness among the coffins, he saw the face of a child who seemed to be watching him, amused, as if playing hide and seek with him. He was just about to go up the stairs when the grandfather came down, who noticed the paleness on my father's face. He explained as best he could, and the man just smiled and kept working. The voices stopped being heard upstairs shortly after. The owner came down to say goodbye to both of them and told them she would see them in the morning and to finish soon. My father tried to concentrate on the repair, but he could not stop feeling that there was a ghost child spying on them from the dark. He tried to be rational, but then he heard the grandfather's veiled laugh. He looked up and saw the man smiling as he looked towards the dark, as if he were playing with someone. When they finished the repair and went upstairs, the grandfather asked my father to accompany him. He followed him to the second floor, where all the rooms had the doors open. My father noticed it from then on and later confirmed it, and it seemed that until very recently the owners had lived in that house. The grandfather took my father to a room in the background, which looked more like an office. They entered, and a portrait of a smiling little boy dominated the room. He was a child with Down syndrome, about 5 years old. "He died a long time ago," said the grandfather. "But he was here. Since then, he was here in the house." My dad had never expected a revelation like that. Although it terrified him, the face of that child, the smile, made him feel relieved for a moment. He just nodded, and they headed out. As always, my dad would go with his grandpa to his truck. There was a too hot wind outside. For a moment he felt his face burn. The grandfather, in his incomplete Spanish, tried to explain to him that the house was a special place, but that there was nothing to worry about. They said goodbye, and my father stood at the door of the house to wave goodbye, a custom he always had. But the grandfather rolled down the truck window and desperately asked him to run towards him. "Run," he shouted without ceasing. When my father approached, he said he would get in the truck and my father only obeyed. "What's going on?" my father asked, very surprised, still suffering from that impression. "I had never seen her," said the grandfather, pointing to the door of the house. Then my dad looked carefully at the open door, where he had been a moment ago. Barely a meter from where he stood, but inside, a woman dressed completely in black was watching them. That was just the true beginning of the nightmare. That house had always been special, my father had been told. Perhaps before it was a funeral home, all the dead people would have passed through its walls. Perhaps that is why they chose it precisely to fulfill that function. There, death seemed to mean something else. For one reason, Unlike what happened in the surrounding streets, there the neighbors left a huge space between that house and its buildings, made at the farthest end of its property. Now, already at night and after all day working, my father and the man were a few meters from her, watching a black woman who was looking at him, a look full of hatred, of resentment. Suddenly, the woman just turned around and walked in, losing herself in the darkness. The grandfather touched his chest as if he were in pain, a result, evidently, that he was really very scared. My father asked him if he was okay, if he was taking him to the hospital, if he was taking him home. But he only asked for a moment to recover, and they sat in the truck. "You can't stay, you can't stay," the man repeated to my father. But he answered that it was his job, that he could not risk losing that opportunity. And he didn't do it because he wasn't afraid. In fact, the reaction of the grandfather, that same man who apparently had learned to live with a ghost in that house, worried him. What the hell was that woman who caused the grandfather such deep terror? Almost an hour later, the grandfather told him that he had to leave and asked him one last time to leave, but my father refused. He entered the house while the grandfather watched him from his truck. He closed the first metal mesh door and made a sign with his hand. The grandfather started the march very slowly, as if waiting for my father to repent at the last moment. Something had changed, despite the fact that he already had the feeling that he shouldn't be there. At that moment everything had changed all of a sudden. It was as if something was oppressing his chest, as if the gravity of the house had changed, as if a scream that couldn't be heard came out of his head. He went to the bathroom and even noticed that his nose was bleeding. He breathed heavily, he could barely close his eyes. He woke up from the cry of a child. He immediately thought of that portrait, of what he could hear in the basement. My father approached the door. He opened it slightly and the crying seemed to come from a distant corner of the house, but he didn't dare to go out. When he was about to close it, he heard the voice of a woman who seemed to be talking to the child, speaking to him in a threatening and mocking way at the same time. Did he have to go out? What the hell was happening? How could he know how to react in a situation like that? A scream echoed throughout the house and my father fell backwards, breathing heavily. He began to pray, and just as the first words came out of his mouth, the footsteps of someone who was running towards his room made him stop and get up to close the door and secure it. He began to look among his things. He had a number for emergencies to find the owner. When he finally found it, he began to doubt if he could talk to her at that time of the morning. Was it correct? Was it really an emergency, or were they going to make fun of him? Or were they going to take away his job? He couldn't stop thinking, in the look, in the smile of the child in the photograph, and that if he was there was also something out there with him. Then he knew what he had to do, no matter what. He had to get out of the room. He had heard someone running towards her door, but he did not hear her move away. So she could well be behind him, waiting for him. He looked down. He could barely see, but he could not see any shadow. He had to take a risk. What would you have done? He opened the door. No one was there anymore. He went out and stealthily made his way to the living room where the phone was. Everything was silent now. It seemed like there was nothing and no one in the whole world around my father. All the lights were on, but they began to flicker. He felt them dimming. He was waiting to run out if that happened, but they only grew fainter, as if the voltage had dropped. For some reason, he felt that it was no longer the right thing to call, so, without turning off a single light, he walked back to his room. As he passed through the door to the basement, he heard the voice of the child. Agitated, the child said something, but my father did not understand it. Nor was he sure that he was talking to him. The voice fell silent, and my father rushed to his room. As soon as he lay down, he fell asleep as if he hadn't slept for a day. He didn't even manage to set the alarm to turn off the lights as soon as it dawned, before the owner arrived. When it had already dawned, she woke him up, knocking on his door in an alarmed way. My father got up, thinking immediately of a scolding for having left the lights on. However, when he left, He realized that all the drawers of each piece of furniture in the house were open, with things outside as if they had been thrown. Everything in the house had been profaned in one way or another. That concern faded into the background when my dad managed to explain to her. "Not the kid. Someone else is here. There's someone else here." The lady asked my father to go with the grandfather to the center of the town, to look for some things, but he felt it more as a pretext to get him out of the house. My dad seemed to be living in a dream. Everything seemed intangible to him. Everything seemed to be just a nightmare that he could not wake up from, and he just kept going and getting deeper into it without being able to avoid it. They went to the town. They looked for what they had been entrusted with. They had a coffee, forgetting everything, and then they went back to the funeral home. Just when they arrived, a black old woman came out of the place. She gave a look of anger to the grandfather, who ignored her. "Bad woman." Which, the grandfather told my father, explaining what that look was about. The grandfather went to leave some of the things that they had taken to a room behind the house where they kept that kind of thing. My father entered. Inside the house, darkness seemed to reign, although outside it was just evening. He heard the voice of the lady in the basement. He approached to see what was happening. From the stairs he could see her at the end of them, calling someone, as if he wanted someone to come out of the darkness. A man whom he had never seen before was halfway up the stairs, and when he saw my father, he approached them to close the door. He understood then that whatever was happening down there did not concern him. He returned to the kitchen, and from there he could see the grandfather struggling with the door of the little room next to the house, and something caught his attention, something that he could not have confused because, as I told you, it was just getting dark, the sun had barely set, and he could still see clearly from the outside. The black woman, the same black woman, was about 100 meters from the house and approached the grandfather at a supernatural speed. She had her hands crossed to the front, and although her dress hid her legs, it was evident that he was not moving them, that he was not really running. My father shouted at the grandfather from the window and pointed to the woman. The grandfather, as he could, ran with his tired legs towards the front of the house, and my father found him on the porch. "Let's go, this is no longer our business, come with me," said the grandfather, but my father nodded once more. That would be the last time he saw my father alive. He rushed up to his truck and left at full speed for a carcass like the one he had. My father entered the house again and ran towards the basement door. As he passed by, he saw the woman in black, or something that looked like it, halfway down the stairs to the second floor. He desperately knocked on the basement door, and that unknown man opened it. Before my father could say anything, the guy ordered him to help him. He then followed him to the room outside, and they took out a folding metal bed from there. They took it back to the house, and then he asked my father to go to one of the upstairs bedrooms for blankets and pillows. Without thinking, my dad went for them, and suddenly the desire to comply, to help, was stronger than the fear of what he had just seen right there. However, upon arriving upstairs, everything seemed to be calm, and he entered the first room to remove the bedclothes. Just as he was doing so, the sound of prayers from afar began to draw his attention. It was the voice of a woman, and then another seemed to join in, then another, until my father left the room with his bedclothes in his arms. From the floor below seemed to come out the prayers of a whole congregation. But it was nothing he knew, and it did not sound like something Christian. Whatever he was hearing didn't feel good. As he approached the stairs, he noticed where they were coming from. It seemed to be coming from the viewing room, but nothing was prepared for that day. No one was supposed to be going to the house. When he began to go down the stairs to the first floor, the voices fell silent. He was taking slow, very slow steps, going down with fear of what he could see when he reached the end, not being able to avoid turning towards the door that was in that room. When he came down, he had his eyes fixed on the front. He tried with all his strength to walk to his left and head to the basement, but he couldn't. It was as if his neck was forced to turn to his right and see. When he did so, Inside the viewing room he could see at least the first row of the place where there was a group of hunkered figures, apparently people covered in black from their feet to their heads, people who had stopped their prayers and now watched him. One of them got up, turned to the door and started walking towards my dad. When he seemed to be unable to resist, when he was about to faint, that woman spoke to him in perfect Spanish and covered her face. "Sorry, we didn't want to scare you," my dad said. "We came as soon as we could to help, and when we heard the steps on the stairs, we thought that something else was coming down." My father also apologized and explained that for a moment he thought they were also something else. The woman returned to the room without stopping to explain to my father who they were or what they were doing. And then he went to the basement. He touched it and after a few seconds they opened it. The owner and the stranger finished assembling the bed. Apparently she would stay there. And the man said to my dad, "This is the only place in the house where I could not enter." I could not enter. Who? Or what? My dad didn't understand anything and something in his head was starting to tire him out. That sense of a countdown that he had been expecting at the beginning of those 2 months. Now it was more marked. He felt that everything was going through something. He felt that something terrible was about to happen. After a few hours of listening to those continuous prayers, they finally stopped. My dad was sitting on the porch, and from there he could see how a group of women came out of the viewing room, the ones who had previously entered completely covered. Now he could see them well. They were young and old women, different from each other. Among them was the girl who had spoken to him, and there was even a nun in that group. And in the end, the woman with whom he had run into when returning from the village, the witch, of whom the grandfather had warned him. This woman noticed him sitting on the porch and spoke to the young woman who spoke Spanish. She said something in her ear and then the young woman addressed my father again. "Rest today," she said. "Today the house will be at peace, but not tomorrow." "What can I do?" my father asked, his heart full of fear. "What can I do if she returns?" "Run. Get out of here if you see something strange. Run while you have the chance," the young woman replied. "I can't leave. I promised. I need to be here 2 months. Then I'll go with my sister." My father, for some reason, could not help crying while he said that. "If you see something, run, please," the woman told him as she approached and touched his face. Then he moved away to reach the rest of the women who were already waiting for him on the way. "I'm going to stay," my father said. "I'm going to stay, and I will pray. It is the only thing I know how to do." The young woman turned and smiled at my father with tenderness. "Pray all you want, but it will be of no use. Here you will not find God." The woman moved away and a deep sadness, a deep desolation, came to my father with those last words. Maybe he had understood the feeling that he had in that house from the moment he arrived. For the first time in his life he felt completely alone. For the first time in his life he felt Christ in his heart. He called my mother for a few minutes that night. He told her some of the things that happened to him. Somehow it was a sad night for us too. I remember it well, although at that time no one understood why. Sadness invaded our house for thousands of kilometers. When my mom hung up, she felt disheveled. She couldn't stand listening to my dad like that, and she was very worried about the few details he gave her. She said it so convinced that she couldn't stop worrying, wishing to be with him. As soon as they hung up, my mom went to bed because she felt bad all of a sudden. She felt very sick from one moment to the next. That night, at dawn, something happened in our house, although my mom still says it was a hallucination because of the fever she had at that moment, all of a sudden. What I could tell you is that that night I heard my mother's footsteps and someone else's footsteps outside the room. But perhaps it is the memories that play a bad game on me and that seek to unite the pieces somehow, the pieces of what happened to my father. My mother, as I told you, felt very bad from the call. Then she woke up in the morning, soaked in sweat. He looked for a crucifix in the drawer of his bureau, an object that belonged to his mother, Catholic like his whole family, and that always managed to calm him down. However, he did not find it. He turned on the light of the small lamp and completely stirred the drawer, but it was not there. He got up, already feeling weak, because of the illness or because of the pills he had taken, and he went to the kitchen for water to calm the unbearable thirst that suddenly invaded him. When something came out, a sound on his back called his attention. He held onto the wall and turned. The light of the moon through a lamp light illuminated very faintly the other end of the corridor. My mother then saw her crucifix on the wall, but not as it was. She saw a crucifix of real size, and on it, crucified, someone who was not Jesus, but looked like him, who breathed with pain, filling his chest and exhaling with pain, someone who looked fixedly at my mother. She was obviously terrified, but she knew or wanted to understand that she was hallucinating, that her mind was playing a macabre joke. She turned around to go to the kitchen, and behind her she heard that something fell, as if that false Jesus on the wall had soon fallen from the cross. Without turning, she kept walking towards the kitchen, but behind her she heard how she got up, that she was there, and started walking towards her. The next thing she remembers are the arms of my grandparents trying to hold her and take her back to bed, where my grandmother stayed with her to take care of her for the rest of the night. I remember hearing the voices of the grandparents when I found her in the kitchen from my room, but, as I told you, my memory may be deceiving me because I also remember hearing the footsteps of 2 people in that corridor. We never told my dad. That night, for him, as they had announced, was quiet. Quiet inside what fit in that situation. The owner did not leave the basement all night and a very low fog surrounded the whole house. When my father turned around all the corridors, turning off the lights, he noticed the black woman standing on the porch, looking inside through the door, standing there without muttering, with that expressionless face that looked more like a pale mask. "You can't come in, can you?" My father yelled. The woman couldn't stop looking at him. "No, you can't come in," he said in a low voice while he took another pill to control his nerves. "Today you can't come in." He approached the kitchen, to the same window that faced the field. He could see through the fog, the figures of dozens of people standing there, watching the house. No, the woman would not be able to enter that night. But outside she was no longer the only one waiting to do so. My father wished at that moment that the night could last forever. He turned around the house unable to sleep, taking the pills that, as they had told him, would end his nerves immediately. He heard in the basement that someone was running from one side to the other, stuck in his nerves, but for some reason he knew it wasn't the owner. "There's someone with her down there," he thought. "Definitely, there's someone." He heard footsteps on the porch that caught his attention. He looked up and realized that the woman in black was no longer in front of the door. He was walking down the porch, and suddenly he couldn't hear the footsteps on the wood either. He was walking around the house. Another sound caught his attention, this time from the window at the end of the corridor that led to the basement and in whose background was her room. There, the woman's hand forced the window to open it. My father wanted to remember if at any moment he noticed if the window was closed or not, but before he could think clearly, the window opened. The woman's arm began to slide inwards. The black hair. He started to get in too. My father ran in her direction, but to get to the door to the basement, where he began to play desperate. "It is the only place in the house where I could not enter." Those words of the stranger did not stop throbbing in his head while he touched and touched, once again begging the old woman to let him in. He finally opened the door and, after taking a look at the hallway, he allowed it. My dad went downstairs to see the light of a small lamp next to the bed, the only light that illuminated the large basement. "What's wrong with you, boy? What's wrong? Why are you so pale?" My dad thought he understood. Someone came in through the window. The women said no, but he came in. "What are you talking about?" she asked him in Spanish. No, none of that, no, my dad continued. She looked at him very confused. He didn't know what to answer. The lady, more than anyone, should be the only one who could believe him. The woman looked at the bottle of pills in my dad's hand. "What are you taking? What do you have there?" The pills for the nerves you told me to take," he replied, stuttering. "No, I didn't." The woman's gaze was of amazement, of compassion, more than of anger. "When did I give them to you? Do you remember? Tell me when I gave them to you." My dad couldn't remember. The pills. It was as if they had reached him at some point, but not anymore. He couldn't remember when they were given to him, how it happened, and if it wasn't like that, if it hadn't been her, where the hell did he get them? "Sleep for a while," the lady said as she pointed to her bed. My father obviously refused, but she insisted. She promised that when he woke up his mind would be clearer and he would look at everything in a different way. My dad, deep down, even though his mind was flying through the craziest possibilities, wanted everything to disappear suddenly. It was a possibility that he was imagining everything. It had to be a possibility. A possibility. That was repeated to my father while he was asleep, and with his eyes closed, he noticed the woman walking from one side to the other through the basement. My dad started dreaming that he was with us at home. He ate with us. We were all together in the dream, and everything seemed to move in slow motion. I hugged him, and my dad could feel that hug in his whole soul. Then we walked and every step seemed very long, heavy. Each step seemed to have a fundamental importance. I turned to the table and there was his favorite food. He approached and began to try it. It was the best soup of his life. My mother approached and told him that everything was fine. That everything was fine now. And then he noticed his belly. My mom was pregnant. He cried with happiness. He asked her why she had not told him before. "Because you will never know him," my mother said to him, smiling. What are you talking about? What are you talking about?" "Nothing, take your pill." My mom tried to give him pills in his sleep, and my dad refused. No, my dad yelled at him. And then that in the dream was no longer my mother. At some point my dad had opened his eyes and it was the owner of the place, who was almost on him, with a pill between her fingers. Before he could ask her, demand that she explain what the hell was happening, the lady tried to tell him in Spanish and English that he was screaming, that he seemed to be having a terrible nightmare, and that she just wanted to help him. My father got up and went up the stairs. "The boy," my father said before leaving. "The boy is down here, right?" "There's no boy, young man," she replied. "Everything you see, you have it here," she said, touching her head. It was 3 in the morning. My dad went out, and for the first time since he had arrived, he felt he could see clearly. The house now seemed normal, dark, yes, but he no longer believed he saw demons among the shadows. He called my mother from his room, lying in his bed, already more calm, and tried to explain to her. He apologized for the last few days, but he said he already felt better. "Maybe I'm going crazy for living in a funeral home," he said as he laughed. "Imagine what it is to spend the night in a huge house, already in itself tetric, which also works like the oldest funeral home in this place. All our dead people pass by here," they told me when they arrived. My mother did not answer. She didn't say much, she was almost asleep, but my dad was content just to hear her. "Well, I'll hang up so you can keep sleeping," he told her. "My love," my mom said before hanging up, "I think I'm pregnant." The news fell like a bucket of cold water to my dad, not because of the pregnancy, but because the dream he had just started to make sense. The dream that also made him feel as if he were never going home. When he hung up, he heard someone laughing at him, but as if trying to hide their laughter, as if they did not want to be heard. It was as if someone was making fun of him, murmuring. My father at this moment felt more upset than scared. He took a hammer that for some reason was in the kitchen and went around the house with it. He walked down the hallways looking for the origin of those whispers, but he didn't find anything. Everything seemed to be in order. The house was completely empty. He breathed lightly, but his hands kept shaking. He returned to his room, but before entering, he noticed it. In his bed, the one he had left untouched for a few seconds, there was someone lying down, covered, his back to his head. When he took a step back, whatever was in his bedroom made a strange sound, as if it could not stand the laughter, and it uncovered its head a little, enough to let him see black, rotten hair, like the hair of a dead man who has come out of the grave. Then it turned to my father. Was it the woman in black? There was something on her face. It made my father feel the deepest fear in his heart, a fear that made him lose all hope, a fear that made him die a little from that moment. We never knew what he saw in her. In fact, the first time I heard this part of the story in my childhood, I imagined the face of a monster. A woman came out of the grave looking to torment the living, the inhabitants of that house. But today I don't know what to think. I don't know what to imagine of what he saw, of what he could have seen. A screaming scream woke my father up. A horrible scream, like he had never heard before. He realized that he had fallen unconscious in front of his room. The door was open, and a rotten smell came out of there. My father could almost feel that smell in him. A new scream made him turn. It came from the viewing room, so he ran over there. On his way, she noticed that the basement door was open. The lights down there were on, but it looked like there was no one. In the living room was the housekeeper, running from one side to the other. "No, she's not there. My child is not there," she said, crying, disconsolate, to my father. He took him, she took him. My dad remembered the smile of that child in the photograph. He knew he couldn't understand why he was there, but he knew he was an innocent, a little angel who couldn't leave, or who had been left behind to take care of his mother, and who was now in the hands of a demonic being, the darkest that walks on earth. He ran to the basement. He shouted at the boy and looked in the dark corners, behind the attics where he had heard him for the last time. The woman, the owner, kept screaming upstairs, and he heard her steps running desperate from one side to the other. The screams suddenly stopped. The light went out. Suddenly, my father was trapped in the darkness of that basement. He felt as if a little hand was pulling his pants. Without seeing anything at all, he tried to touch in that direction, but he didn't feel anything. Then he was pulled back again. It was as if a little hand was suddenly pressing him. He turned and stretched his arms, but nothing, he couldn't touch anything. That's how he felt that little hand on his legs several times, until it was clearly squeezing his leg right above his knee. He lowered his hand to try to touch the child's hand, but he felt something different, skin falling. He began to run. He felt hair, rotten hair. What was pressing him was not a hand, it was a mouth. It was the mouth of whatever he had seen in his room a while before. He felt that his heart was about to give up, but he fought to get rid of it and then to find the stairs in the dark. He climbed up, dragging her, and although someone had closed the door securely, the adrenaline allowed him to open it and tear it from its hinges several times. He went out, stumbling, dizzy, through the corridor. He ran to his room, but suddenly someone was lying there, covered up to his head. He ran to the kitchen and noticed the woman, the owner, looking at the field behind the house. Far, far away, barely reaching to see. My father noticed the figure of the woman in black walking into the darkness. She was holding a child in her hand, and they disappeared in a few seconds. The owner of the house shouted and ran over there, to get lost in the darkness. He, paralyzed, was left alone again in that house, as on his first day. He was not going to return to his room. Someone was there. He was going to leave his clothes. He was going to leave everything he had taken, but his passport. It was in the safe of a second-floor office. There he had asked him to keep it. So he ran up, went into the room and started trying to open that box. He had seen when they put the combination, but he hadn't paid enough attention. He only remembered the movement of the fingers. 2, 3, 2, 4. No. 5, 6, 5, 7. Neither. He kept trying, by memory, trying to imitate the movement. And a smell, a rotten smell, approached. It approached more and more through the corridor. The safe opened. He had finally given up, in some way, with the combination. "Thank you, my God," he shouted. And at that very moment, when he said those words, he heard again the prayers coming from below, from the viewing room. Despite the fact that the plague had reached his door, he left the room. The lights seemed to have returned, but they were more tenuous than ever, much less than half light. The lights in the viewing room were completely off, but he heard the women pray with all clarity. He approached them to ask for help and turned on the light, but when he did so, he saw that the room was completely empty. Surprised, he noticed that behind him, now, along the corridor, were the figures of more than 10 black women, covered from their feet to their heads, looking at him. He knew these were not the women he had seen before. He ran out of there, took the road, and kept running without looking back until his legs could no longer carry him, until he fell to his knees from exhaustion. Dawn was breaking, but the darkness of that house, of that place, still covered him. Who knows how many minutes passed when he heard the sound of a car approaching. It stopped next to him. Several women came, including that girl who had warned him. He went down to ask her what was happening, how she was. "The woman is gone, the child is gone, they took him. I left my little bag, I left all my things there," my dad said through tears. "Let's go get them," the woman told him, but my dad refused. For nothing in the world would he return to the house. The girl returned to the car and said something to the women, who got out and they followed on foot down the road. She asked my father to board the car. "I can take you to a safe place. Then I'll look for your things and I'll take them to you. Don't worry, you're almost home." On the way, my father told her everything that happened. And the woman didn't go out. They arrived at a motel on one side of the road before entering Gonzales. The girl got out of the car and then came back with a key for my father. "Stay in your room. If you need something to eat, ask them to bring it to you. Don't go. My father went down with nothing more than what he had in his pockets and $20 that the girl gave him. The next morning, when they found my father's body, the room was full of bottles of liquor and pills that no one can explain where they came from. He seemed to be calmer when I left him at the motel, said the girl, Lucia, when she visited us in Mexico months later, when she told us part of what she had lived. Evidently, he never explained other things that my father told us, like why she had gone to the house or who were the women who accompanied her. But he did make it very clear that whatever had tormented my father in his last hours, he was tied to that house and there was no way for him to leave. When my mother went to Gonzales, she went to pick up the body. He was able to talk to his grandfather, the man who had been a companion, unfortunately, for my father's last few days. In the morgue, when the owner of the funeral home suddenly appeared and offered my mother to take my father's body so that it would not be there, my grandfather made a signal to my mother that he would not accept. Transporting the body back to Mexico was expensive. My mother carried everything we had gathered, but it wasn't enough. And the woman insisted on taking the body to the funeral home while she managed to gather the rest. The grandfather then appeared with his savings and gave them to my mother so that she could pay for the transfer. Once everything was settled, my mom asked the grandfather to take her to the place where my father had been found. The man accepted as if out of obligation, and they drove there in silence. It seemed that as soon as she arrived, the workers at the place knew who my mother was. They were very kind to her, especially a Latino guy who tried to explain to her what my father's last hours had been like. "It was very bad, he looked very bad," he said. I think everything he was taking affected him a lot because at dawn he spoke at the reception asking for help, saying that a woman was floating in her room. The truth is that none of us believed him because people who take or use drugs are already regular customers of this place, he said. No one imagined her husband was so ill. Only recently my mom told us this. She had hidden my father's last moments from us as long as she could. But she has come to accept that he died of terror. I don't know what happened with that woman from the funeral home, but the last we heard was that she continued with her business with complete tranquility, as if nothing had happened. My aunt, perhaps due to the guilt she felt, stopped speaking to us completely, although for a long time she sent us some money monthly. I don't know if someone ever lied to us or if we have been confused throughout our lives, but because of several things that have happened, that have occurred here in this house, because of several things we have lived, I am sure that whatever it was that haunted that house, at some point, found its way out. After my father's death, there was a period of great difficulty, a strange period for my family and for me, in which it is difficult for me to identify what was real and what was a dream. A stage that I lived like passing it automatically. From what we have talked about later, with my family and with the people close to me, I know that much of that, which for me were nightmares, are events that really happened to us. The first happened weeks after Dad's death, when I was alone at home. After what happened, I don't know if it was a good idea or not, but there were no longer any crucifixes or anything similar in the house. It was an empty house in that sense, spiritually, although, well, it was still full of books. I received a call around 11 at night. I thought it could be my mom, an emergency at the moment, but there was no one on the other side of the line. Silence. So I hung up. Moments later, the phone rang again. I answered with anger, and all I could hear on the other side of the line was a strange, agitated breath. "How disgusting you are, pervert," I said as I hung up. But once again the phone rang, and I picked it up, expecting to hear that sound again to curse it, but there was nothing. And then, a little interference. What I heard next was something I will never be able to forget. I will never be able to forget what it made me feel. I heard my dad's voice, talking with all tranquility with someone else. I heard them very far, very low, as if someone was recording the conversation hidden. And eventually I could recognize him, recognize the other voice. It was the voice of Zamora, a policeman who had been a great friend of my father, but of whom we had years without knowing anything. I stayed listening for a while, until the conversation suddenly dropped. There was no sound for minutes until the same breathing was heard again, but now farther from the phone. I hung up and felt a lot of confusion. What had I heard? What had just happened? When I told my mother, we let it go as one of the strange things that joined our collection of experiences. Sometime later, a cousin of my father, who was also a policeman for a while, told us that several friends of my father's had died during a shooting, among them Zamora. Doing the calculations, the dates on which it happened coincided at least with the month in which I remembered having received that call, when Lucia, that woman who told us details of my father's experience, visited us. We felt a kind of relief. His voice, his presence. It was extremely calm. A person like that who seems to transmit good vibes, a lot of peace. Somehow we accepted him as a comforting visit, and in fact, we mentioned him with a lot of insistence when we talked to someone else. That visit that made us feel better, seeing from another perspective, with some tranquility, that horrendous trance that my father had to go through. However, that visit coincided with something else, that although we never experienced, made us worry very seriously. Doña Juani, a neighbor who did not interact much with us, once found us passing by the market that was close to home on Sundays. She told us, having fun, that Daniel, her youngest son, was very afraid to pass in front of our house since the last few weeks. You'd think he says he sees a witch in black who is always standing on top of that big tree in their yard, looking at their living room window, always trying to peek inside. Every time we pass, this child turns away so as not to see her, but he also says he sees ghosts everywhere. Then the neighbor proceeded to tell us stories that, honestly, we didn't even care about, concerning what the child claimed to observe in his house and other places. No, what left us thinking was the description of the woman who appeared in our house, a description that made us think of what took my dad. We never saw her. The last time that neighbor told us something was that the child no longer saw her in the tree, but in the window, standing next to our living room window, pressed against it as if she were about to enter. While these first stories happened very close to my dad's passing, This last thing happened very, very recently, just a few weeks ago, after this story was heard. Although I don't live with my mother, I have always kept my key to enter. At this point, my brothers always spend time outside too, although in theory they live there. I stayed to dinner with my mom. I told her that I would arrive around 9 o'clock, and we usually dine late when we see each other, almost 10 o'clock. My mom was going to be with Alejandro, a friend of hers with whom she goes out on occasions, and she told me that she would arrive at 9:30 maximum. I thought about that. I trusted. When it was almost time, instead of going straight home, I stopped for dinner, so I wouldn't have to make it at home as I always do. I thought of bringing her fried chicken, as it's my mom's favorite takeout. My mother arrived punctual, at the calculated time, 9:30, and she was surprised to find it open but the lights off. But, well, I am a strange person, she thought, so she didn't pay attention. And while I was leaving his things, he could see me dancing in the living room, in the background, with the music that was coming from the neighbor's house, an old music like a movie from the 50s. When he turned on the light, he lost sight of me, and then he heard the sound of my car when he arrived, and that's when he realized that he hadn't seen it, that is, that I wasn't the one who was in there. Until today, we want to think that what she saw that night was an intruder who, in an attempt to escape, seemed to be dancing at the back of the living room. Yes, it sounds ridiculous, I know, but I prefer my mother to convince herself of that. I still haven't told her that I shared our story, but I will soon, and she will hear it soon.